Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to Season 11 of The View Up Here. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is May 15th, 2019. Tonight, Newfoundland and Labrador votes with Con O'Brien. Newfoundland and Labrador may have only joined Confederation in 1949 to become Canada's 10th province. But May 16th, tomorrow, is the 50th general election in its history. The House of Assembly has 40 seats, one of the rare legislatures with an even number. This election comes at a momentous time in the history of the province, due to more than one major issue that will likely decide its future for generations. Muskrat Falls. As the inquiry into how the largest project ever undertaken in the history of Newfoundland rolls on, the evidence is clear. This project should have never happened, but it is virtually complete and will commence operations later this year. What will also commence is the massive debt repayment of a project that doubled in price under false promises and predictions. The next 70 years will require money that isn't readily available to pay for what has rightly been called a boondoggle. But the bills don't stop coming. The cod fishery. Mismanagement is a huge understatement in the handling of what was once the greatest natural fishery on Earth. The cod moratorium started in 1992 and was supposed to last a few years. 27 years on, the latest numbers indicate it will not be lifted anytime soon. It changed the way of life, the culture, and the population lineage, never to be the same again. Healthcare. For a long time, healthcare results in Newfoundland have been the last in Canada with very high costs. Will this election change any of the systemic problems within it? And where will the money come from? The View Up Here welcomes Con O'Brien, a true Newfoundlander from a family with literally centuries of experience on the water and in the cod fishing way of life. Frontman for legendary Newfoundland folk group the Irish Descendants. Con joins us to discuss the election, the Muskrat Falls disaster, thoughts on whether the cod will ever return, and the debt-ridden future of tomorrow's Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. Now, this show was supposed to air last week, May 8th. Technical difficulties prevented that. This interview was recorded on, I believe, May 5th, but there's nothing that's been superseded in what we're going to talk about with Con. After the interview, I've got some updates, some latest polling, and I'll address a couple issues that Con brings up. So without any further ado, here's the interview with Con O'Brien. The View Up Here is proud to welcome Mr. Con O'Brien, probably best known to most Canadians as the guitar player and vocalist and more or less frontman for the Irish Descendants. He is a true Newfoundlander and I thought of no better place to go to get the actual situation on the ground in Newfoundland and Labrador, considering us especially out west, really don't get a whole lot of it on the national scene. Con, welcome to the show. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
From my end of it, I've been really pushed in the last few months, starting with the Ontario election, then Quebec, and then we had New Brunswick, and we had PEI, and we had Alberta. Newfoundland has been moved up from an October date by legislation. The story I've heard is that to avoid conflict with the federal election, but considering what's going on with the formation of a new party on the right, with all the noise about Muskrat Falls, about the continual poor performance of healthcare in Newfoundland, is Premier Ball trying to get ahead of the curve, or is there a different point to this?
Well, I think that that particular issue is not something that was really sprung on the electorate or on the parties in general. He came out early on in the year and said there was going to be a spring election before school was out, which gave a lot of the parties, ample time to get organised. The Conservative Party here, the PC Party under Chester Crosby, was first out of the gate with nominations. They managed to nominate candidates in all but one at a last-minute dropout, which was unfortunate for them. But the two parties, the Liberals, PCs, have been dominating the political landscape here for time and eternity, since Joey Smallwood pretty well. And unfortunately, the NDP here, they've had a sort of a structural implosion of their own within their ranks, and this is nothing new for them. They have had trouble keeping themselves together for a long period of time. They have in the last 2 to 3 elections managed to come up with a full slate of candidates, but this time they came up very, very short. I think they've only managed to nominate 14 candidates. And as you mentioned earlier, we have a brand new party called the Newfoundland Alliance, which is a kind of an offshoot from the Conservatives, the former Conservative president of the Conservative Party, the PC Party of Newfoundland, and by the name of Braden Pelly, who managed to put together in a very short order, about less than a year, a party, and I think they've nominated 9 people in some of the strategic locations or strategic districts across the island. Mr. Ball has been very sort of upfront in that there's no surprise to the electorate that this was coming, and again the reasoning is that doesn't want to coincide with a fall election federally, and and that's a situation where these set election dates sometimes have conflicts like that. For the most part, I think people here were not surprised that he called the election, and for the most part, there was some sour grapes about it, especially amongst the NDP. But the NDP, they've gone through a leadership change and an internal blow-up that saw the former leader Jerry Rogers, who has been one of the two members of the House in the last couple of years, sort of leaving her position and leaving politics. So internally, they seem to have conflicts going on that didn't really bode well for the timing for them. But that being said, you have an awful lot of stalwart NDP members and former people who run for candidates for the party. They have 2 seats in the House. But they've had lots of well-known characters who have run for them over the years, who have now left the party and some of them have drifted over with the Liberals. We have a gentleman by the name of George Murphy, who was a member for the NDP up until a couple of years ago. When they had their most numbers in the House of Assembly, I think they had 5 seats, and George was one of them. Jerry Rogers, the leader at the time, was a woman by the name of Lorraine Michael. But in this election, you're seeing Mr. Murphy, who's a very well-known fellow. He does this weekly update of the price of gas. Consumers for the price of gas is what he calls himself. And he's able to dictate or sort of predict which way gas prices are going, and everybody knows him very well. Have another young woman by the name of Nicole Kiley, who was a candidate for the NDP in the last election. They've moved over to the Liberals and are running for Liberals this time. So, there's always going to be people who will question the reasoning behind calling the election early like that. But we don't need a summer election. Well, it's going to be bad enough as it is trying to get people out to vote. But at this point in time, I don't think for the majority of people, it was that much a surprise.
I did watch the televised debate, which only had three party leaders: Dwight Ball, Ches Crosby, and Alison Coffin, the leader of the NDP.
CBC and the local Telegram, the local newspaper, were kind of in charge, or they put together this debate. And the reasoning behind not letting the Alliance in there is because they had nobody in the House of Assembly. And so they omitted them. And it caused a lot of a backlash for the media themselves. They took a lot of slack over it. And in actual fact, it ended up that the guy, the next morning gets to come on all the major outlets. He gets hours and hours of good time to talk about the things that were discussed in the debate. And I didn't hear a lot of that, but from what I understand, they had a debate the night before, one of the unions, a debate where he was included. And from what I gather, I didn't get to see that debate myself, but what I gather that he had done very, very well in that debate. So it was a bit of a faux pas on the media. Media, here especially CBC should have known better. The guy put together, in a very short order, new political party and managed to find 9 candidates to go up. Now, whether or not they're going to have success in the election, I'm not sure. And if you look at the polling, it's close for the Conservatives and the Liberals and the Conservatives. It has been close throughout the last few months, with a great number of undecided at the bottom of the list. So I wouldn't be surprised if they picked up a seat. Now, unfortunately for Mr. Pelly, yesterday or the day before, his wife's mother passed away. So he sort of suspended his campaign for a few days, but it leaves him now sort of scrabbling.
Indeed, it does. So what you're saying is the same media outlets that denied Mr. Pelly from being in the televised debate, the next day gave him as much coverage as he wants.
Well, he got on the Crosstalk on CBC, which is an hour-long show, so he got a full hour. If he had been on the debate, he would have got a quarter of the hour. And the media also omitted one of the major outlets, VOCM, which is a radio station in St. John's that has coverage right across the island up in the Labrador, has probably the most popular talk show that there is, and a very, very popular host, a very knowledgeable host, a fellow by the name of Paddy Daly. They omitted Paddy Daly from that debate. He should have been there asking questions or moderating it. There was a little bit of a hoo-ha about that. It's typical in this day and age with social media. People get their dander up right away when things like that occur, and Paddy's not afraid to speak his mind either. He wasn't very happy. And, this particular radio station has a lot of influence, and people call. It's a very popular show, and so omitting him as well was in my view a big mistake.
Well, it's unfortunate that so much of the focus comes off the actual parties and platforms and the media seems to take it with their own stupidity, but I guess that's not an exclusive thing. When we look at what Dwight Ball and the Liberals are proposing in the budget before announcing this election, it does seem like a typically Liberal budget, does it not? They've tried the electricity rate mitigation plan for Muskrat Falls. This is a big issue comparing the Liberals to the PCs and Ches Crosby, with Crosby having a higher maximum price per kilowatt hour as the doomsday nears for Muskrat Falls.
Essentially, none of them have a viable plan in that regard. The Liberals are depending on doing some sort of a transaction, whether that be through our funding of the Atlantic Accord or with some sort of new money coming from the federal government to help mitigate. We're facing a tremendous, daunting situation with Muskrat Falls. Muskrat Falls is the biggest piece of insanity in Canadian history. And we here in Newfoundland are on the hook now for close to $14 billion. And whatever way you slice it, there's no customers for the excess power And the only people who will be paying for this is the ratepayers in Newfoundland and Labrador through their light bills. That was the plan from the very beginning. But now what we find is that for the terms of the mortgage of this fiasco, which is close to 70 years, we're going to have to find somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion a year to operate and mitigate the rates. The 500,000 people in Newfoundland are on the hook. What we're seeing now is people scurrying to find ways to lower their power use. And as a result, it's a take-or-pay power purchase agreement with the ratepayers in Newfoundland, no matter what it costs and how much it comes out at the beginning. If you remember, it was $6.2 billion starting off. It is now close to $14 billion and rising. You know, it's just it's a situation where we have an oil-producing province that's going to have to find the second line of our budget for the next 70 years are going to be rate mitigation and debt service, where it used to be education. And we have, we've gone from Danny Williams' time in the 2003 era where we had a $4 and $5 billion budget. We are now at $8 and $9 billion budgets. When the oil was up and everybody was living high off the hog, we added 20,000 people to our public service and cut income tax rates. And that's why you have a fellow like Danny Williams become the most popular premier in the province or in the country. No trouble to be popular when you're doling out money like there's no end. No one looked at the bottom line. No one looked, if you've been following the Muskrat Falls inquiry, which has been going on since last fall, the oversight was zero. And the reason the oversight was zero is because the power purchase agreement is a take-or-pay deal, and the people of Newfoundland are on the hook no matter what. Lenders are protected. Everybody else is protected, but myself and my children and their children. So it's a terrible, terrible situation.
Muskrat Falls, I agree, is the largest disaster financially and as far as the whole concept of it being approved in Canada. But yet we have Site C to come, so there could be some strong competition.
Site C is another disaster. We are dealing with several million people to pay for it, not 500. We're the size of Hamilton, and we're a poor nation. The fishery, one of the mainstays of our economy is the fishery. The fishery here is in dire straits.
Before we get into specific issues, I just want to go over what the PCs have proposed as a budget. There's a lot of things that are a little bit surprising for a PC government, but the question I ask is what they're basing the revenues on. They're assuming the tax revenue will go up by $80 million, but they're promising a tax cut. They're also writing into their plan that oil revenues are going to climb by tens of millions of dollars. So how serious is this? I mean, it's nice to put out a book that says, yes, with chess, but is it worth anything?
Got these highfalutin expectations based on unrealistic ways of looking at it. They'll do what they can to get elected. The PCs here are the ones that hoisted Muskrat Falls on the population. And we're going to depend on these people who did absolutely no due diligence when they decided to do that big project to come back and try and fix it. People here are not buying that the way they should. They're blaming the Ball government for a lot of troubles. The last election in 2015, Mr. Ball had made a lot of promises, only to find that when he took over the government that we were over $1.5 billion short of what we thought we were going to be, and that Muskrat Falls was $2 billion over and above what they thought it was on unreliable reporting. So, you get a brand new government who's after coming up with lots of ideas, and the people are now fed up with the PCs. Danny Williams' reign, he left us with 2 or 3 premiers that were just there. People that, Mr. Underdale, Davis. He had another fellow that was going to become the new premier who stepped down, a fellow by the name of Coleman. And then they lose the election as subsequent to that. And people were just fed up with what was happening, especially with Muskrat Falls. And I mean, I don't know if you've watched any of the inquiry, but the politicians who have been on the stand, the biggest thing they can say is, I don't recall. And I can tell you that my children, who were 13 and 10, sitting around my kitchen table, knew more about the inner workings of Muskrat Falls than some of these characters did, and it's a terrible shame that we find ourselves in that position. Newfoundland, since 2006, we've gone through $26 billion. That's 26,000 million And the roads here are deplorable. We have people that are going to our mental hospital in St. John's was erected right during Queen Victoria's reign, right around the time Lincoln was president. We have promises of hospitals in the major centres that have been promised for 15 years now, and they blew through that kind of money in a very short period of time. That's our heritage fund. That's my children's future. And not only that, they've now financed my children's future on their credit cards with no real remedy for fixing this. So this is a basket case situation for Newfoundland, and maybe it's responsible government we need here in the future, because we've had a history of having nothing. We've been here for 500 years, and we're a transient population, mostly from the British Isles, who came here in search of hope and a good future based on the cod fishery. And it's no different than a Newfoundlander going to Fort McMurray today. They go there for opportunity. And we've managed to survive here for 500 years, very little. And then when something big came, it's like the guy who wins the lottery and blows the million 3 weeks after he gets it. And that's what we've done. When Danny Williams becomes the most popular premier in the country, it's very simple. You spend your way into popularity. It's a false perception, bringing down the flag, showing our nationalism, and we're going to beat everybody. And Quebec did us in on the upper Churchill, so we're going to get them. But my children did not have a $15 billion grudge against Quebec, and I don't think anybody's children here did. And that's what's been pushed down our throats. And now we find ourselves in one colossal mess.
Well, I think that's completely accurate. I mean, I've been following Muskrat Falls for years. I think when we discuss what is really relevant to the present and the immediate future for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, we have to look at the inquiry that's going on. Now, I go back to September of last year in part one of the inquiry, when there was a forensic audit on Nowcor Energy, which is basically the Crown Corporation, I do believe, for the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric project, among other things. The things that really jump out at me is there was no serious talks at all with Quebec about any deal for excess power.
And they came up with reports that theorized that we couldn't do business with Quebec because they weren't capable of doing the business with them. We couldn't buy power from them. Our situation was that the island itself, in the dead of winter, had a shortfall in generation, very close to being at peak demand for a handful of days during the very cold parts of January and February. And we experienced, a situation in 2014 which unveiled to the population how bad the situation was. We had a thing called Dark Newfoundland, where we had 14 or 15 days of rolling blackouts, complete island blackouts, and people, in their homes trying to keep their pipes from freezing. People died as a result. They suffocated themselves with carbon dioxide from running their generators. And it showed that there was a need. What they did with that situation was to add a little bit of thermal generation, 120 megawatts of power, into our on-island grid. And that really rectified the situation. The real situation for us is that in 2041, we get back the Upper Churchill, which is 5,400 megawatts of power. And had we been able to just figure out a way to add cheaply some more thermal generation to the island, we would have been able to get to that point. But they decided that they wanted to go take our oil money and go spend it. And when you're deciding to spend $6.2 billion and you lie about the demand and you lie about a whole bunch of things to make sure that this thing gets through, there's a lot of plums fall off a $6 billion truck. And there's going to be a lot of rich people in this island. The Chess Crosbys of the world? Chess Crosby is a very interesting situation. I was a member of a group called 2041. Which was a group of engineers, lawyers, accountants who had a petition about the dismissal of the Public Utilities Board from the process of determining whether or not this was going to be the best cost option and the way we should or should not go, which was complete dismissal of democracy as far as I'm concerned. Mr. Crosby's father was a proponent of Muskrat Falls. showed up to the announcement dressed up as the lieutenant governor in his regalia. And, John Crosby is a very influential politician, an influential man in this place. And back then, if Danny said it was good, it had to be good. And unfortunately, we didn't have the people who were in the know. There was an awful lot of business people in particular. We have like the fellow running Nalcor right now, who replaced Ed Martin. Sam Marshall knew the difference, spoke about it, and as soon as he took over the reins of Nalcor, he just declared it a boondoggle. That's what it is. And, he got cut in half by Danny Williams and these people. You're not my kind of guy. And if you got enough people who are going to sit on the back end of that truck where the plums are falling off, that's one way they keep their mouth shut. Guys like Ches Crosby, Ches will say today that I wasn't there. This wasn't my doing. Well, you kept your mouth shut, Mr. Crosby, when you're a learned man and you knew the difference. And there was people who were big Tories here. A childhood friend of my family is a man named Cabot Martin. Cabot Martin is the man who wrote the Atlantic Accord, the original Atlantic Accord. He was Brian Peckford's executive assistant back then. He also wrote the wording for Canada's portion of the 200-mile limit. An extremely intelligent fellow who was the biggest kind of Tory that you could ever want to meet. And there's other fellows who are in the same position. I don't know if you know about Uncle Gnarly. Have you read Uncle Gnarly's blog?
I have, yes.
Well, Des Sullivan, again, another Peckford-era executive, worked in Peckford's office. These are big Tories who came out and put their neck on the line and said, hey, this is a terrible deal. When Cabot Martin came to me and said shale gas means that the 16 cent per kilowatt hour power that we're going to be generating in Labrador and transmitting to the United States, or hopefully transmitting to the United States, is now going to be competing with shale gas generated power in the United States. That means it's going to be 2.5 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And he likened it to this. He said, you cannot try and grow bananas in Newfoundland and be profitable in Panama. This is the same situation. Shale gas is not going away. The proponents of the day were telling us back when oil started to drop in 2014, went from $135 a barrel in February over to $80 in October. The government's guru economists that they used to and still pull out from time to time to reassure us about the economics of things, came on the radio and said, well, it's at $80 now, and the shale gas producers in the United States are not competitive at $80. Well, I can tell you right now, they're now self-sufficient in oil, and they're profitable at $15 a barrel. So that's what we're dealing with. That's what Alberta is dealing with. Mr. Tenney is going to be in big trouble when he comes up 4 years from now and hasn't done anything about the oil, because there's nothing a politician can do about the price of oil. Mr. Trudeau has no say in the price of oil. We import an awful lot of oil from Saudi Arabia in this country to our refineries. The oil from Alberta is no good to our refineries in the east. It has to go somewhere else, unless you're going to start to build new infrastructure. And, as the world is changing their attitude on fossil fuels, and it won't happen in my lifetime or your lifetime, or probably even in my children's lifetime. But in the amount of time that we've been burning fossil fuels, about 140 years or so, very less time than that we're going to be weaned off.
It's not only the obvious reluctance to even talk to Quebec as far as hydroelectricity goes, but the other thing that I found really giving away that this was just not a legitimate enterprise was the question that you mentioned about the isolated island option. And it was like, no, forget it. We just simply can't do that. We have to interconnect with Labrador. And hasn't that been a big, big source of where all this money keeps disappearing, with this line running to the island that they never really considered if it was needed or not? They just wanted it.
Well, in 2041, when we get our power from the Upper Churchill, that'd be 10 years before that comes down, might be time to think about building that power line. The way they've built it, they've managed to put together a power line that we now know doesn't have any sort of reliability. It's a 1,200 kilometer cable from Muskrat Falls down to just outside of St. John's, and that power has to be converted there and then shipped across Newfoundland to the maritime link. Now we've had to relinquish to the Nova Scotians, who got in early on the deal, and we needed them to get the federal loan guarantee, but they didn't omit They're public utilities boards. They're the URAB in Nova Scotia comes back a year after we sanction this project and say, well, sorry, Mira, you have to go make a better deal because there's better cost options in natural gas for the ratepayers in Nova Scotia, and the difference somewhere between $750 million and $1.4 billion. We had original deal was they were getting 20% of the power, so about 140 megawatts at 16 cents a kilowatt hour. But at the end of the day, to rectify and to keep them in the deal, they had to change that amount to about 360 megawatts at 4.2 cents.
Wow.
And they also had to relinquish from 28% of the Labrador Island Link up to 65% of the Labrador Island Link, which essentially privatizes the main line coming from our generation system in Labrador. This is beyond fiasco. You had a bunch of oil men, the head of Nalcor, Mr. Ed Martin. He never built anything in his life. They never built they couldn't do anything. They haven't done anything in respect to a major mega project or hydro dam. At the end of the day, the last laugh is going to be that we're going to have to find either some Mr. Trudeau or some Mr. Scheer or whoever is going to be the man in charge in Ottawa is going to have to find us a way out of this war. And, when Danny Williams came up with this idea, there was no talk of the revenue pools like our oil royalties, different sorts of opportunities where the rate of return to Nalcor is going to be turned over to rate mitigation. If everybody goes off the grid here, and they all install their own solar panels, the system will collapse, and someone is going to have to bail us poor people out. I mean, I know we have tremendous opportunities with oil. Price of oil, thankfully, has been fairly stable for the last 6 or 8 months, but again, oil was $74 a barrel last week. It's down to $69 today. And for every dollar that it comes down, it's $20 million off the bottom line of our royalties. That's a lot of dough in a little place.
Absolutely. Now we move to this year for part 2 of the inquiry. In February, the forensic audit was really looked at. Grant Thornton, who did it, presented it before the inquiry, and they said, yes, we have absolute proof. At that point in time, they said the cost of Muskrat Falls was $12.7 billion, and that's basically double from 2012. They said that even in 2013, mere months after construction started, there were big red flags that things were going wrong.
The federal loan guarantee is signed, and that was signed in September of 2013 when Mr. Harper arrived down. Coincidentally, a couple of days before, the CEO of SNC Lavalin and this guy, another gentleman by the name of Rihad Ben-Assah, who were principals in the McGill Hospital scandal. These are the people who did that deal. This is the template was used. You want to talk about SNC covert prosecution? Someone should look down here really close to what happened. There's a lot of question marks in my mind about how this was put together and why it was put together. So there's a lot of questions how this got rammed through. And again, the democracy completely taken away from them when the Public Utilities Board was omitted. They were given an opportunity to look at it. They were just hamstrung by no information, deadline to meet, and not enough information to do it, not enough time to make the thing. So these guys come back and said we couldn't determine it. And Danny Williams called them every traitor in the book, and on we go.
Yeah, that's the point exactly that I got from reading about the Grant Thornton audit. The first contracts they were putting out, the bids were coming in 60 to 160% higher than Nalcor's estimates.
And then they also were in the situation of buying equipment that was, the generators and the transformers and all the things that you needed. This stuff starts to arrive, years ahead of the time that it's needed. I was looking at transformers on a wharf over in my hometown that were there for almost 2 years before they got shipped to Labrador, and they're only being installed now, sitting on the ground. They had the money gone. We got it to the point of no return, and it didn't matter. Once financial close happened, we are on the hook to finish the project. If we don't finish the project, the government of Canada comes in and takes over and finishes it on our dime. So there is no point of no return, and the lost cost or the sunken cost fallacy, that just gets sent out the window. This thing should have been shut down in 2013 or 14, and we would have had to swallow $3 or $4 billion, which we had in cash into the deal. The government of the day from 2006 to 2012 of the sanction stashed away $3.75 billion while we ran deficits of board money. And that was for the equity of Muskrat Falls because the lenders needed to be protected. They wanted 40% equity. They wanted like a child, like a young man and his wife going up to the bank to mortgage their house, and the banker looking at them and saying, "Well, you need to come to me with 40% of the $300,000 your house is going to cost. No, by the way, we need Dad's co-signature on it as well."
The other thing that really gets me about how negligent and non-existent Nalcor oversight was a Italian contractor named Astaldi. And the audit that Grant Thornton did said that $1.2 billion at least in overruns is directly attributable to the main contractor. How does this happen? Where is the oversight?
They had no experience in Nordic conditions. You know, Acon from your part of the world were bidding on the contract, were shut out. And, you know, somewhere along the line, Astaldi comes in and gets the bid, the lowest bid, you know, 1.4 billion. I don't remember exactly. But in no time flat, they needed 800 million more. And the first thing they did was they decided they were going to try and pour cement in the wintertime in Labrador. And the way that they were going to do that is by building what they called a production dome. So they were going to build a great big structure over the powerhouse and the south side dam. And this was going to gain productivity. The dome itself cost $300 million to build. They only erected half of it when they figured out this was no more useful than you know, absolutely no use to them at all. So not only did they lose the $300 million because they hauled it down to the scrapyard, but they also lost the productivity of that season. So now you've got this big deep hole up in the ground that's now flooded. And all kinds of situations. We have another situation called the North Spur, which is 50% of the dam, which is a natural asset. And if you're familiar with Mount Polly, familiar with Oso, Washington, this is a Crustrian clay that is marine glacial clay that it's a quick clay. So what we are doing up in Labrador, this has never been done before. We're building a dam that's founded on marine glacial clay with a berm that's full of marine glacial clay, and we're betting on Nalcor, who has absolutely no construction experience, that their plan for the stabilization of this natural asset is going to be good. The leading experts in the world, a man from Sweden who ran the biggest company in Sweden, built the modeling around how quick clay reacts to downhill landslides, tells them that they're out to lunch. They're about to flood this dam this summer. So this spring they're going to start to flood this dam from 18 meters up to 37. If that could easily go down the river and take out the little town of Goose Bay and little places like Mud Lake. Mud Lake is a small little community on a sandbar in the middle of the river. They've already flooded them up to their doors in a situation where people have been living there for 200 years and never saw anything like that ever occur. So we got big problems. If that happens, we now have a dam that has no water going. We also have no rights to the water. The Upper Churchill, the situation with the Upper Churchill means that Quebec controls that river. The water management agreement that Nalcor assumed they could use is in the Quebec courts. If we lose that deal, and we haven't won any more cases with Quebec in my history, we have an 840 megawatt generating station that's going to be able to generate about 140 megawatts. They cost $14 billion because they didn't do the due diligence and assumed that they could take the water and do what they like. What they were doing with the water is they're going to take power from the Upper Churchill and sort of pay that off. We don't have the ability to do it legally. They did it anyway.
Wow. I mean, the more you look at it, the more I don't see how you can disagree. This is the most ignored, fact-based mega project approval I've ever heard of.
Well, I mean, do the numbers on it. If it was in Ontario where there's 8 million people, you would have to have a project somewhere along the lines of $300 billion to equal what we've done. It's insanity on top of insanity. All because the elite of mostly St. John's business crowd that were stung by the Upper Churchill deal wanted revenge. That card was played all along the way. Big bad Quebec was the reason, behind an awful lot of this, and they rolled out the flag, and we're going to get around them. By God, we got around them all right, but it was going to cost the little children of this place to mitigate and operate Muskrat Falls over the terms of the mortgage is going to cost somewhere between $70 and $80 billion out of the general coffers of the province. no matter what stripe you are, that has to come. Second line is about $1 billion in debt service on top of that. So we now our health at $3 billion, and then Muskrat Falls and debt service at $2 billion, and education is $1 billion. That's the third line of our budget now, which was always the second line. And this place is going to empty. This is going to make the cotton moratorium look like a day, like a fun day, like a garden party. We lost 40,000 people in 1992, and there's nowhere for them to go.
I think this a definite history mark. Everybody, not only in every Canadian province, but in a lot of places around the world, should take a look at Muskrat Falls and sees what happens when you try and bullshit your way through the biggest thing your province has ever done.
That's right, and it will be a case study in that our media was duped. There was absolutely no in investigative journalism. Anybody who did speak up were shunned and called fools, and again, you're against us, and you're not for Newfoundland, and you're not, that sort of stuff that went on. It's just a litany of a whole bunch of lies that created a perfect storm that allowed it to happen. And we needed a little fix on the island. That was in the form we got that. It cost about $100 million to put in the new generator in Hollywood that they can turn on when they need it during the peak demand. And yeah, we got to fuel it. But fuel went from $150 a barrel down to $60. So, it's cheaper to fuel these thermal plants now than it was. And shale gas, again, means that this thing, financially, economically, and they knew it. Shale gas is not new. It's been around since around 2010 in a big way. And they just completely dismissed that. I can remember the chair of the board of directors in Nalcor at the annual general meeting in 2012 saying, we're not doing any navel gazing on the price of oil. We've got good advice, and we're going ahead anyway. This is a guy who delivered the newspaper to Danny Williams, all right? Some kid who worked in his cable company. And that's what you got. You got a whole bunch of nepotism and people, jumping on the bandwagon, and everything he touches is going to be gold. They thought this was going to. They thought the price of oil was going to stay high forever.
The present day, as far as the Muskrat Falls reality, which is becoming more apparent every day, finally, when we look at it in this election campaign, the government of the day, the Liberals, have come up with what they call mitigating measures, but again, they're based on estimates that are nothing but best case scenarios. They're just hoping. There's no guarantees on anything.
That's right, and it's the same thing where they promised that the ratepayers and the taxpayers won't be affected. And originally we were dealing with a situation where 16.5 cents. That's because oil was going up so high. That if we continued on with thermal generation, that this is what we would have to pay, is 16.5 cents. So they justified the economics of it based on that. But the reality of that is that people can't afford 16.5 cents on their light bills here. They got to make decisions between prescription drugs, food on the table, or being warm in Canada. It's not electricity and hydropower. That's what you're using to power up your people. That's just as much of a necessity in life as water or food. It's no different. So if you told everybody, hey, by the way, the food is going to go up by 100% for the next 70 years, it'd be a war. That's what you get. For people have no concept of the magnitude of it. They don't understand what $1 billion is. That's the reality we in, and they won't realize it until the bills come.
Well, the thing that gets me is it sounds like this was framed as estimating the cost of oil fired. They took the highest possible estimate they could pass off, and then what they were touting as the price for Muskrat Falls Online was the best case, lowest price they could possibly pass off, and it turned out to be the absolute opposite in reality.
Exactly, and the double-edged part of this sort is that, hey, when oil is $150 a barrel, we can afford to pay for a lot of our sins. But now we got the situation where oil revenues are down by 50%. Paying for these sins is a lot harder because, we've gone from a $5 billion budget back in 2003 to a $9 billion budget in 2012. And, people's expectations, you got all those people hired, 20,000 people in the public service. You mentioned that you're going to fire, a bunch of them, and who gets elected? The other crowd. You're going to say the things that need to be done to fix this, Well, you're going to get your arse tossed out of the driveway as quick as they look at you, because people don't want to hear about that. They don't want to hear about the price of a levy on their gas. They don't want to. I mean, but they were down here in 2016, and we had a budget that required $1.3 billion going up to Nalcor to keep the Muskrat Falls project going. That they had to find 300 different ways to cut money from the people's services. We're going to cut all the libraries in Newfoundland. It's going to be, what hospital are we going to shut down next? As the island population sort of comes out of the outports, fishery dictates that. I'm from a town that's 30 miles from St. John's. It's a big fishing town. That town and the little towns around it, they're 1,500 people, but they're major centres in this part of the world. You go 100 miles south of us here. When I was a young man, there was a town there called Trepassey. Trepassey had an offshore fishing plant that had draggers coming from the Grand Banks, working 365 days a year. The population of the town was about 2,500 to 3,000 people. To me, it was like going to a city back then. This place is down to it's an old age home now. There's 350 people living there. One child registered for kindergarten. They have a K-12 school with 36 students in it. And this goes on and on and on across Newfoundland. Everywhere you look, this situation is occurring. And we're being realistic. We got little towns, little island towns that are being, serviced by ferry boats that are costing tens of millions of dollars to a year to run, and there's 50 people there. You gotta be realistic at some point on. I hate the fact that Newfoundland is dying that kind of a slow death. I grew up in a place with a strong fishery. The day that John Crosby announced the moratorium in the cod fishery, my father had to go down on the plant floor and tell 350 people to go home. And they ain't come back. They ain't come back since. Half of them left. The brightest and the youngest had to get out of here. The younger crowd that who normally would go down into the fishing plant or the fishing boat with their mothers and fathers had to go to the universities and learn and get educations that with skills that are very little requirement for them here. So they leave here. If you educate yourself in the oil business and you're lucky enough to get a job in our offshore oil or out the Alberta patch, that was a great bit of help. Bridging the gap that we had in Newfoundland back in 2008, 2009, when the rest of North America was bottom up. It was like a bonanza here. What we spent, you can't take it in with a spoon and put it out with a shovel. That's the situation we're in, and the politicians of the day gambled on oil being $150 a barrel to $200 a barrel for the long-term future, and that's a gamble that they took, and we knew that we lost that gamble long before we sanctioned that project and added $15 billion onto the bottom line.
Well, when I look at what the parties are saying regarding Muskrat Falls in this election, the thing that I find the most ironic, the biggest clue I have that maybe this was a bad idea, the Liberal Party is proposing that they're going to save $175 million in fuel costs at Holyrood. How backwards and back to the future is that?
Well, they're hoping beyond hope that the report that comes in about the reliability of the Labrador Island Link is going to be able to allow them to do it. And you probably, in some ways they could achieve that but they have to refurbish Holyrood. Holyrood is an old station that's a steam-generated station. You can't just go over and flick the switch and turn it on. So from the month of November till the month of May, it has to run, in order to have reliability. And we were told by the proponents when we were building that was the reason we were doing it. We had to get rid of the expensive fueled Holyrood. They didn't keep the maintenance up on it, and they Nalcor let that thing go into shambles to the point where we end up in dark Newfoundland in 2014. And the Premier of the day, Dunderdale, I'll tell you how powerful the guy at Nalcor was. He didn't have to resign, but the Premier did. That says a lot. Nalcor was conceived and put together to build at Lower Churchill at any cost. And now, we find out that, they also have control of our oil revenue, this energy warehouse we got. It's the biggest smile on the face of anybody in the picture when the federal loan guarantee was signed was a fellow named Peter MacKay. Peter MacKay looking on, and Mr. Dexter said they would put themselves in the driver's seat. In the meantime, you had Thomas Mulcair running into Newfoundland telling you how good this deal was and the green energy, trying to buy into the green vote across the country at the time. Or NDP opposition that was much more powerful back then, just smiling and nodding and winking and not opening their mouths about it. But they didn't vote for sanction. The Liberals there was no party here that was against Muskrat Falls. How could you be? 75% of the population was for. So if you had to speak up, then you'd be committing political hara-kiri. So they all were for Muskrat Falls up until the time it comes to sanction. And there's no debate, virtually no debate. We had a filibuster on it. The Liberals and the NDP kept going for a few days. The Minister of Natural Resources, Mr. Kennedy, told the people that the opposition were not sophisticated enough to be able to even debate Muskrat Falls. This is the best and most studied project in our history. We wouldn't do anything that's bad for you. When you find out in the Muskrat Falls inquiry, these cats didn't have a clue about anything.
I think that's what it really shows. There was just, we don't want to hear no. That's it.
That's right. No one cares. And again, when oil is $150 a barrel, you can pay for a lot of these things. I had no political aspirations. For many years, I had no political input at all. I voted, for different parties over the years. I would have to call myself a liberal these days, but back in the Peckford times, Peckford excited young men like me. And we got the Atlantic Accord, and we got the Hibernia, and the future was bright for Newfoundland. Fellows like that excited me. But those kind of politicians don't exist here anymore. Those kinds of visions, that kind of smart politician, these guys don't exist anymore. If you're in a government with Mr. Williams, Mr. Williams hasn't been the Premier since 2006, but he's been pulling all the strings all the way through, and probably still pulling the strings. Every child here born here today is now on the hook for $50,000 as they're being born.
I think that is one of the biggest things, that it's so hard for people to understand the number of people there. Like you said, you're as big as Hamilton, and you're talking $30 billion. That is just an outrageous amount of money.
I was talking to a gentleman who owns a sprinkler factory in Fergus, Ontario. And I started talking to him about, well, how's it going for you? He said, well, my power bill went from $60,000 a month to $120,000 a month. He said, I got to compete with sprinkler factories across the border who are now dealing with 3-cent power. And if you drive down the highway, drive down the 401 from London down to Windsor, and on both sides of the highway, all you see is windmills that the government of the day decided that 80 cents a kilowatt hour wasn't too much to pay for. These things last for 35 years.
The thing I want to turn to next is an issue in Newfoundland and Labrador that never seems to go away, at least not for the last decade, and that's the state of healthcare in Newfoundland.
Yes.
The last thing that I've been able to find that's reliable is from the Conference Board of Canada from 2015. And it was a ranking of every province and territory and a bunch of peer nations and Canada overall. And as far as healthcare goes, there were 3 that scored an A: Switzerland, Sweden, and British Columbia. Canada got a B. At the bottom of the list, with the 3 territories, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Yukon, was Newfoundland at a D-.
Yep. You've got doctors here, all right, and associations of doctors who've come out publicly and said, we see that there's an opportunity here to cut 20% of the cost because of over-testing, the system being on. I'll give you an example. I had a little surgery on a cyst in my tailbone a couple of years ago. I go for an MRI. Specialist surgeon comes and sees me and has a consultation with me before the surgery, says your MRI is great and things are going good, we're going to do this, it'll be fine. And I waited and I got the thing done and it was fine. But in the middle of that, my own doctor calls me up, said, I need to talk to you about your MRI. Now it frightened the life out of me. I'm a big boy. I've smoked all my life. I'm a musician, so the clean living hasn't been what you call, hasn't been great. So I get frightened to death, and I go down. He wants to tell me about how good it is, and collect his fee for my visitation. So there's skullduggery and robbery going on within the system. We have other doctors and their groups coming out and saying that we can find a 20% savings. Well, our budget is for healthcare is $3 billion. 20% is $600 million. 10 years of that pays off the original cost of Muskrat Falls. And that's where we are. And they'll say, well, it's remote. We have geographical issues and whatnot. But we have clinics on top of clinics on top of clinics filled up with the public servants that Danny Williams decided to spend the money on. We now have to come to terms with that and figure out what we're going to shut down. But meanwhile, we have a mental hospital again that was built in the Victorian times. We have a penitentiary in St. John's that was built in Victorian times that need replacing. And we don't have the wherewithal. We should have the wherewithal to do it. The situation with healthcare here is that people want the comfort of healthcare. They don't want to drive too far down the road to get it.
See, now this is a story that's familiar to me in Alberta. Alberta, especially the health system, still has an infrastructure deficit from Ralph Klein in the 1990s. You just don't recover from ignoring those things for a generation. If there's no infrastructure rejuvenation going on with the healthcare system in Newfoundland, how can it ever get better? I mean, has anybody got any answers for this, or they just try and ignore it?
We finally have a Minister of Health who's actually a doctor. That's the first time since around 2000. We've had people running our healthcare system who barely had grade 12. You get into that situation where our government is being micromanaged from the 8th floor of the Confederation building, and you don't open your mouth until I tell you to open your mouth, and this is how it's going to be. And the same thing, we have a big deficit in infrastructure, and in some places just overkill in infrastructure. Again, it's to be popular. It's Danny Williams raising the flag and going to fight the federal government, rah the troops, while he's spending $26 billion on the children's credit card. That's money that should have been put away. Our debt should be paid down. Someone's going to have to drive 50 miles to the clinic. That's the fact of the matter. I mean, I have to drive to the city to go to a hospital. I live in a little town with 2 private clinics where there's 9 doctors. Some of them are mostly passing out Percocets and oxycodone, and that's the situation we're in.
So it seems to me like there is just not much desire to save money if the money we save won't be going into my pocket in the health system there.
Well, no one wants to hear about cutting. If you were Mr. Ball had to cut drastic. He promised no HSD after the last election. Gets in power and finds out we're $2 billion, short in the general revenue, general coffers in the treasury. And Muskrat Falls is going to require $2 more billion. There's no bank going to give you the money. You got to go take the money out of somewhere. That's tax hikes and cuts in services. No one wants to hear that. What has to be done, no one wants to hear about it. No one's going to vote for it. They're hardly going to vote for it.
That's the issue right there. Nobody votes for the truth. I guess that's human nature in the 21st century to an extent. Is there going to be any progress on the healthcare in Newfoundland and Labrador, no matter who wins this election? Is anything going to change?
I think so. I mean, there's no choice but change. Because, again, the money has to be found to pay the operations of Muskrat Falls and mitigate rates. We also have to find the $1 billion a year in debt services that we now require. So there's no choice. We were down to the borrowing for 30 days. So, I mean, that requires some drastic action. And like every politician, they're going to be branded as liars, but the population, the ones that are calling them liars are the ones that don't want, like you say, they don't want the truth. They just want to continue with the status quo and hope, you can hope in one hand and shit in the other, see which one fills up first.
Well, I hope that things improve there because, as we talked before, we started recording, I told you that I lived in Fort McMurray for almost 8 years. And one of the guaranteed first things you would hear from Newfoundlanders who came to northern Alberta was the first time they had to go through the health system. And they were amazed. It's like, it actually works here.
You go in our health system, there's lineups, waiting periods. You can't go to a doctor with the gout and a cold. They'll only deal with one thing at a time, for the most part, because they want you to visit 3 times. So
they can bill 3 times.
Someone has to cut these cats in half. They're all getting rich on the system. Then they'll tell you, it's hard to find doctors in Newfoundland because of the remoteness and people don't want to come. And we got doctors from in the last 30 years, mostly from the British Isles, lots of Irish doctors coming in because it's better here than it is there.
Well, that's the bottom line for them, isn't it?
That's the bottom line. Both their families and their children are moved to St. John's. It's a little bit of home away from home in some respects, and the system here allows them to be very comfortable. I'm not taking away their professionals, and they're trained, and they deserve to be paid what they're worth, but they're able to manipulate that system, and that costs a lot of money. And people expect the services. They expect to be cared for. We're in an aging demographic here, so the place is soon going to be the young people here. The birth rate is down. Back in my day, they were having 9, 10 children in the family. Now they're lucky to have families with 1 or 2. That's the way it is. And the schools are empty. But again, you can go through the smaller communities where there's schools, K-12 schools with less than 50 people in them. We got to keep that up. These people are there in those little towns, and they got crab licenses, and they got fishing enterprises. They've built their lives there, and they expect to be able to stay there. Who wants to leave the place that their forefathers built up over the last 450 years? No one. I don't want my children to have to leave Newfoundland. That's the last thing that I want to have happen. That reality is probably just a tougher thing to attain for the future. And we had the luxury of being able to go out here, or Western Canada. No different than the Irish that came here. My people came here in 1721, came for opportunity. We stayed because you built your world around you. And now we're faced with a mass exodus again. We didn't know what we were going to do in 1992. We had 2 or 3 fish plants with people working in it. So we started to import codfish from Russia. That's the kind of resilience that you have to try and break to keep the small portion of your people working in your markets. We were told back then that it was going to be a couple of years. People don't know what's going on with the cod stocks. Really, we see cod returning to the coastline, the big numbers in the last 4 or 5 years. The government of Canada, under primarily Mr. Harper, just wiped out science. Who wants to pay for scientists and a bunch of defeatists down in Newfoundland?
Plus, they'll give answers that are based on facts, and they won't go along with what we're selling. So,
Well, they don't want to hear facts. They only want to buy votes. They buy votes with fishing licenses and wharfs. You want a fish plant, you get one. Back in the day, if you want a crab license, you got one. And what destroyed our fishery had been technology. Mostly it's a destructive form of catching fish called the otter trawl. And from the first onset of the otter trawl showing up here in the late 1940s until 1992, it took almost exactly 50 years to eradicate a fishery that was 400 years old. Now, it's pretty simple. You don't need to be a scientist or a rocket scientist to figure that out. If you took every tractor in Canada and lowered the blade on it and went crisscrossed across the prairies with the blades down, there wouldn't be much grow on them. The water column feeds on the bottom. The grass on the bottom feeds the small fish feed the big fish. You take away the food for the small fish, then you take away the whole thing. And that's what we did. We scourged the continental shelf with draggers, and this is a worldwide phenomenon. One of the chances Mr. Trudeau should take is to try and be bold and say, hey, let's make a mark on the world and let's stop this onslaught. You can't take all the sediment off the continental shelf faster than the rivers of North America can replace it. That's a fact, and we had the richest fishery on the planet. Newfoundland has given an awful lot to the Confederation. We've given them our resources, that fishing resource, gone. Mismanaged totally by bureaucrats from Ottawa who've never spent a day in their lives on a wharf. When I was 10 years old, I went down to the fish plant like every other 10-year-old boy, and I met my grandfather. My grandfather took me out into the back room where all the knives and the things were kept for the workers, and he presented you with a knife and a steel and a file, and then he brought you down to on the factory floor and introduced you to one of the hand cutters, men who were cutting the fillets off the fish. And that person was to show you how to sharpen that knife. And then as a 10 or 12-year-old, you went out into where the offal was coming out of the fish plant, and you vied for position to capture enough heads to cut the tongues out of it. And out of those tongues, you learned to use that sharp knife, which was first and foremost, that was his idea, because he knew that you were going down and he worked at his plant, and yield in that plant was very important. You had to know how to sharpen that knife. You had to know how to use it. But what I also learned, I had to learn to get along with my fellow tongue cutters, the other 10-year-olds. I was down in the middle of a fish plant, the heads coming out through a chute, fighting with a sharp knife in my hand. All right, vying, and there was older guys there who didn't knock me there. And you had to work and get your position. You had to learn how to hone that skill. And then when I had the ability to do that, I went with my bucket of cod tongues, and I had to bring them to market, which meant walking up the road from the fish plant and knocking on someone's door and saying, "Excuse me, madam, would you like to buy some tongues today?" What happened with our fish is very simple. Total allowable catches were maintained and expanded. As the fish stocks were depleted, the size of the codfish started to get smaller, but they didn't reduce the total allowable catches. So in sheer numbers, we had to kill twice as many fish to get the weight. We blame it on the Portuguese and the Spanish, and we blame it on a whole bunch of stuff, but we did it ourselves. I watched it happen. I was the last generation to see it. We needed 1 million pounds of codfish every day to run our factory.
I think that's a very important thing that gets overlooked. The weight limits never changed.
Went up. Mr. Crosby would be Federal Minister of Fisheries, disregarded the scientists of the day completely. I can remember my father and other men in the industry and the fishermen. We were what you would call an inshore plant, so a seasonal operation running from May until October. And we saw the writing on the wall. The fish was getting smaller. We couldn't market the fish in our traditional markets anymore because it was too small. We weren't paying fishermen for fish under a certain size, but they were bringing it ashore anyway. These people are desperate, you know. You got to get enough to get through the winter and get your unemployment stamps. The men and women working in the industry, they could tell you. You didn't need a scientist to tell you. They could tell you what was happening, but no one listened. And again, as I said, like now, no one wants to hear the truth.
And just as those fishermen were forced to bring in smaller fish, they weren't leaving them in the ocean to get bigger.
To grow and to spawn, and we captured fish on the Grand Banks in spawning seasons when fish are conjugating. We run through these spawning fish with this technology that's disruptive. There's not enough steel on the planet to make hooks enough to catch the codfish on the Grand Banks. There's just not enough steel on the planet if you want to make enough hooks to catch it all. But we took this terrible destructive technology that uses great big steel doors to keep the mouth of the trawl open, while a ship with thousands of horsepower drags it down across the bottom, zigzagging across 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
It has come back into the mainstream a little bit nationally over the last year. I remember back to March in 2018, there was the latest numbers from the DFO that suddenly the increase in cod stocks had suddenly disappeared, heading back down.
We're back at pre-moratorium numbers.
The other thing is, as soon as that study came out, in June of 2018, already there was hints that people did know what was going on, but it was, presented as, like, could this be the issue? And, I mean, I'm looking at something from CBC from mid-June 2018 that says, Newfoundland's cod comeback faces a setback. Is fishing to blame? Isn't that like 20 years too late?
Exactly.
The thing that gets me is reading this article, it says, with those signs of gradual recovery, came pressure to restart the commercial cod fishery, even just on a small scale. aren't those just pure political decisions, as you said, trying to buy votes?
There's no young people getting into the fishery anymore. We go over my hometown. The youngest person operating a fishing boat is in his mid-50s. 10 years from now, he'll be done, and his children are no longer going to go there. There's no opportunity for them. They got to go to Alberta, and there's no Alberta anymore. I mean, everybody was working on a mega project. We just had, we're coming off 3 major mega projects here: Muskrat Falls and the building of Hebron and another oil development. Once they're over, they're over.
After those studies came out in 2018 and the, I guess, expected hands in the air goes, in October of 2018, the Fish, Food and Allied Workers Union, FFAW Unifor, said that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans must ban offshore draggers.
About time.
Arbitrary decisions that are arrived at politically make that much difference.
That's exactly right. And it's hard on the fabric of society. We don't see each other anymore. We all went down to the plant and we talked it over. We saw each other, and everybody knew each other. I knew every family in the harbour. Someone in every house worked in our fish plant. I went down and I played cards at the lunch tables with the ladies on their lunch break. And that doesn't happen anymore. So we don't know about what's happening in each other's lives. And it's been nothing but, jealousies, sort of, the whole social thing getting completely thrown out. One time we were equal.
And again, that's just decisions made at a political level that just have all the real effects on the actual citizenry.
Buying votes with fish.
And these are the political decisions that nobody wanted to talk about then, and nobody wants to talk about now. Are there anything from the parties in the campaign that is going to help the fishery? Again, will anybody speak the truth?
There's nobody talking about the fishery.
At all?
Few people. Well, you got strife within the industry with the downturn of losing quotas. So there's talk about that, and you get politicians from those places, especially in further afield, in the outports that, you've got fishing communities here that are huge. They're as big as any fishing community anywhere in the world. And, these people have investments in their enterprises. The average guy with a mid-sized operation, he's got several $1 million invested. You got to pay for all of that. The banks are on the hook, and everybody is, what do? You can't wish it to come back. You have to do something to make it come back. And, the FFAW might want to talk about draggers back then, but that's only talk for a few minutes. They won't want to talk about that right now. That's not sexy. No one wants to hear bad news. They don't want to hear the truth. But what has to be done, and that's not even just, Canada has a big fishery, but that's a worldwide phenomenon. But again, we could lead by example. Our fishery can be sustainable. The other situation with our fishery is that a thing here called the harp seal. The harp seal has gone from about 1 million creatures to 8 or 9 million creatures now, because we don't harvest them like we once did, because the markets of the world have been shut out to us. You can't. Putin shut down seal skins and seal products in Russia, and the same thing has gone on throughout the world. But these creatures are now going up our river, and you're catching seals, and you're taking the belly and stomach of the seal to see what's in it. On that morning, that seal ate 300 female crab. But the seals are out of control, and they're going up the rivers eating trout, because they're starving. They're walking down the streets of central Newfoundland looking for food. Someday we're going to have to call the seals or do something about the seal population. If not, they'll eat us out of house and home. We created the imbalance, so now we have to fix it.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about, Con, is especially out west, we see some sort of national summary report about what's happening with the Newfoundland and Labrador election, and they turn to Ches Crosby, and he gets quoted exactly the same as Kenny in Alberta and Moe in Saskatchewan and Pallister in Manitoba, Ford in Ontario,
and share wherever he's going to be. They're all the same. These people are that's not going to work here. Appealing to 35% of the base, worried about someone going down the road with a hijab on their head. That's not working here, all right? That doesn't work. Newfoundlanders are a little bit more sophisticated than that. We don't care about that. We take in everybody. We had, back in the 80s, there was 150 Sri Lankans show up on our coast, all right? And a good friend of mine, a family friend of mine, found them in the fog. And these people arrive on our shores running from turmoil, and they're accepted, and they come ashore, and they become Canadians, and 90% of them don't stay here. They don't stay in Newfoundland, but they've moved on, mostly to Southern Ontario. And 30 years later, they come back to Newfoundland to honour the man who found them. So the families come back, and if there was 150 of them showed up here in lifeboats that rode in off the Grand Banks 300 miles where they were dropped by some freighter. And what I saw on our tour boat that afternoon was a bunch of very well-heeled, successful people who built lives here. There was one of them who was an MP. They were all businessmen. They showed up with their children who were doctors, lawyers, engineers, all dressed up in the fanciest of clothing, who are now contributing to the country. And that's what we see. We're used to nationalities playing soccer on our waterfront, St. John's. The Portuguese arrived here almost 500 years ago, and the Spanish have been here 500 years catching. And it's sort of been a cosmopolitan place all its whole history. We don't care about if you're a Muslim. We don't care if you're Jewish. We don't care what you are. And we're not buying into this, illegal immigrants coming across our border. That makes absolutely no sense to us. If you told me that I had to put my children aboard a rubber boat, send them across the Mediterranean for refuge with strangers, and that's the bottom line. So Chess can try all he wants. That's not who Chess is anyway. They'll cozy up to one another, but this what we're seeing amongst the conservative parties across this country. What they're trying to do is appeal to 35% of what I call the ignorant base, and they're not going to listen. Those people are going to, same as in the United States. Trump gets elected on pure ignorance, and that's what. And look what the world gets. Our world is way different than that down here.
Well, that's exactly what I was getting to about Chess. What we see out here, the first words that get quoted out of Chess Crosby's mouth are no carbon tax. If he's going to join in with the rest of the conservative doofus club, there is starting to be a discussion that there will be enough conservative provinces to actually open the Constitution, which could be a huge assault on the rights of all Canadians.
They better not try that here, because I can tell you things like the abortion and same-sex marriage and that sort of stuff here, we're over that. There's a small population of Catholics that will go down to the Morgenthaler clinic and protest. But we're not buying it. A woman's right to look after her own body is her right. We're not revisiting that, and there's no Chess Crosby going to change that in Newfoundland. But they'll try. I mean, they may try and take a page out of that book and try it, but it won't work.
Well, that is exactly the answer I was looking for on that question.
It won't work here.
Well, that's good to hear, because, of course, Prince Edward Island just elected a PC government as well, but there has been absolutely nobody who has said that they will be joining this gang of blue, because the man who was elected as premier there actually quit his job in merging the old Progressive Conservatives and the Reform Alliance.
Peter MacKay sells out the Tory party in Canada to go with Stockwell Day and Preston Manning to form up what we now have as a Conservative party. Those are not the same. We're not the same Tories. That's different. When John Crosby and Joe Clark and Mr. Mulroney were running things, they're completely different animals than what we're seeing from Mr. Harper and Mr. Shears of the world.
So I guess then, actually, in the small numbers that are still in Newfoundland and Labrador, it gives you some insulation against the radical minority opinions that gain ground in other places.
Right, but the big problem out in places like Alberta is that you're able to form governments and get governments because there's not enough engagement. People are voting. Not enough people are voting. There's people, if you want to keep them in check, well, get out and vote. believe what if you don't believe what they're saying, if you believe what they're saying and you vote for them, that's what they're hoping for. But they're hoping for the other 70% not to vote. That the 35% gets them by.
Oh, exactly. I mean, I found that out firsthand, and I've told many people, 21st century campaigning is all about finding everybody who will say yes, screw everybody else.
That's right. And direct that narrative along those lines. If you say it enough, people will believe it. And then, there's apathy in the whole thing. If people are not paying attention, going about their business, but they don't go down to the ballot box, well, that's what we'll have. We'll have Trump.
Well, that is the plan of some. So, with your scenario, the Liberals are returned in St. John's.
I'm giving the Liberals 25 seats out of 40, which will be down from where they are presently. They will take the day. I mean, the stink of Muskrat Falls is still very, very strong here. They're still trying to say history will show whether Muskrat Falls is not good. Well, we haven't got 100 years to wait to see if Muskrat Falls is good. We're living in the immediate. We're looking at the next 70 years of misery that your people lowered and hoisted on us without having a look. The smell of that is not gone for a long time. They'll blame Ball for all kinds of troubles that they've had in the recent budgets, and we have an election budget this time, and he's trying to dupe us all into voting for us. The same thing, the 35% are being appealed to, but it's not going to work here.
So there is a political consciousness in Newfoundland that goes beyond team colors. There are still things that matter to people there.
Oh, sure. Of course there is.
Well, that's good to hear, because being in Alberta, I have to wonder about that these days. Well,
I mean, Mr. Kenny comes along and throws in a kamikaze running mate into leadership. What's that all about? This is the kind of people you want running your province, and someone who will try and cheat their way into a leadership by running someone parallel so they discredit the main competitor. This is what we're seeing over here. I mean, we're tired of that skullduggery. Same thing, almost the identical thing happened here in the leadership review prior to the latest one for the Tories, all right? You got a guy, Mr. Ottenheimer, who on the first ballot, was ahead. And then you have a young upstart, no brain, popular fellow, who was, the youngest mayor of the city of Mount Pearl when he was 19 and well able to talk and articulate. He gets urged by Danny Williams to run. And so was Mr. Davis, Premier, who ultimately becomes Premier. On the floor that night, the young guy, sends his support over to Mr. Davis and blows the other crowd out of the water. All right? Now, the other crowd, had they not had the influence of the young fella, would have taken the party. The reality of the situation is that Davis becomes Premier and allows Nalcor to shred money for an extra 3 or 4 years. That's what we get out of it. The same things happen here that'll happen there.
Well, I, for one, don't particularly have a problem with that prediction. I'm a believer in, say, that democracy is a contact sport. If you think you have a democracy where you put an X on a piece of paper once every 4 years and then you just go on about your business, you're never going to have a democracy.
That's a fact. I'm not what you call a political animal naturally. It didn't come by nature for me. I had to wade into the Muskrat Falls issue out of necessity. I'm afraid my little 13-year-old, when it comes time for him to make a decision about what he's going to do with his life, that he won't be able to do it here. And that's the last thing that I can tell you. It nearly brings a tear to my eye just to think about it. The life that I grew up with here, I'll give you an idea, all right? Remember I told you about the knife and the sharp knife? Well, I went down on that wharf after I learned how to cut those tongues for the very first time. And before I was finished, before I was 15 or 16, when I was able to go do something different, more, I could go in the plant and go to work, I caught a million of them, all right? I figure over 1 million tongues with my own hand. My children will never cut one because the opportunity is not there. That's how vast this place is changing. That's one generation. We have a lot to answer for how we handle this place. In our first time in our history, we get a few extra dollars, what we called new money for old rope, one-time oil revenue that one man essentially squandered on us. that can never happen again. If there's anything comes out of the Muskrat Falls inquiry, is that there's no single person should be able to take advantage of a situation and run off with the egg money. Muskrat Falls should be turned into a resort for economic and environmental atrocities. They should put a nice little cable car system to go around and look at it and look down at what we did. That's probably the best thing we could do.
The power of the mob mentality.
Exactly. Mob mentality and raw perception based on false information.
Well, we will see what happens in Newfoundland and Labrador on Thursday, May 16th with the general election. Con O'Brien, I thank you very much for your insight and for being a true Newfoundlander when describing things to the rest of us, because it makes so much more sense that way.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. It's been a wonderful chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there we go. A very enjoyable interview it was. And if you're asking, oh yeah, there's more that didn't make it to air. There are completely separate stories that just would have taken us too far on a tangent. They may come in handy for another show in the future. Who knows? Con, thank you very much. I had a blast. Now, moving on, a few of the things that Con mentioned, as I said, it's basically 10 days ago now when that was recorded. There, I do have some updates. Newfoundland and Labrador go to the polls tomorrow. We talked about the fish food and allied workers. Con mentioned how, oh yeah, at that point in time, when the reports on the fish stocks came out and it was bad news, suddenly they said the government should ban draggers. And Con said, yeah, they'll talk about that for a few minutes, but it's not sexy. Well, interesting that he should phrase it like that. FFAW Unifor sent out a questionnaire to the four parties about what they were going to do about the fishery. I'm not going to go through all the specific answers. What they did is they asked questions and then they gave the parties' answers. They graded them, A to F. And there's a fair amount of questions here. I'll wait to the end to get to my point about it, and which will verify Con's informed prognostication. The first question was, will your government support our recommendation to incrementally increase northern cod harvest rates as the stock grows? Well, the Liberals got a B+, PC's got an A, NDP got an A, NL Alliance got a C. And basically they all said, yeah, sure, right? Business as usual. Will your government continue to promote and invest in technology and infrastructure needed to establish new groundfish fisheries? So they want to turn into the island, get more there. The small operators, seasonal plants become more important as the draggers have less to do. Liberals B, NDP B. The PC's got an A on this one, and the NL Alliance got a D. Will your government continue to support the federal government's commitment to allocate the first 115,000 metric tons of northern cod to owner-operator fish harvesters and indigenous groups? Sounds to me kind of like what Cod was saying about, yeah, we waved the flag. That's sexy. Liberals, A+. NDP, A+. Definitely. NL Alliance got a B on this one. The PC's got an F. They basically would not commit to anything. Will your government commit to collecting from processors accurate information on all product forms processed in Newfoundland and Labrador, including information on production, yield, and domestic and international prices for all species of fish and accompanying byproducts? Now, again, this is like Con said when the science to monitor the fishery was destroyed. The Harper government was named, but I mean, they're not the only culprits. The moratorium was back in 92. And what happened before that to cause the moratorium? Where was the science? So basically this is saying, will you commit that we have to start getting science? The PCs and the NL Alliance got a C, Liberals got a B, NDP got an A. The next question was, will you be willing to put up any money to get young, what they're calling young harvesters, to invest in their own enterprise? So tie them down. Help them out, tie them down. NDP, A+. Liberals, B. PCs and the Alliance, C. To protect their own membership, I guess more than anything with this question, they say, will your government introduce legislation that requires all aquaculture companies operating in Newfoundland and Labrador to establish, as part of a condition of license, a yearly production plan outlining job numbers and weeks of employment? That does make sense. You know how long the season is. You know what you think you're going to get. Why can't you put it together and give it to us before we grant you a license? Makes sense. NDP got an A+. So I'd say, yeah, they're all down for that. Liberals, B. PCs and NL Alliance got Fs. Will your government commit to a robust process to review the impact of offshore oil and gas development on the fishing industry? NDP, A. The Alliance got a B+ on this one. Liberals, C. And the PCs, an F. There are other questions as far as seismic testing, etc., etc. Basically, it's the oil and gas sector running up against the fisheries. There is a question about amending the Labor Relations Act that basically says if a company is sold, the collective bargaining agreement remains. They want protection from indefinite strikes or lockouts. We can apply for a mediator. Either party can apply to the Labor Relations Board with binding arbitration, and ban the use of scab replacement workers. On this question, the NDP got an A+. The Liberals a B, the PCs a B+, the Alliance got a D. Then they asked a question that wasn't necessarily within their industry, but still very union-focused. Will your government ensure skilled trades and metal fabrication work for the Bay du Nord development and other provincial mega projects is carried out by Newfoundland and Labrador workers and is not contracted out of the province? That's even in Alberta. That's coming up now. Alberta, after relying on people from all over Canada for decades, now suddenly wants to get protectionist. Well, of course, the NDP got an A+ on that, but so did the PC party, an A+. The Alliance got a B+, and the Liberals got a C+. Now, what's the other factor that's important about that survey? Just all those questions. Any of them concerning draggers? Gee, what a surprise. The next thing I want to update about is in the last portion of the interview, Khan specifically addressed intolerance, alluded to xenophobia, homophobia a little bit, said that that's not the way on the rock. Well, some of that did make the news. May 10th, Newfoundland Tory leader Ches Crosby boots Michael Normore, candidate with anti-abortion, anti-gay views, a day after backing him. Michael Normore, the candidate for Cartwright-Lance-Eau-Claire, does not support same-sex marriage or abortion, except in cases where the mother's life is in danger. Newfoundland and Labrador Tory leader Ches Crosby says candidate with staunch conservative views won't be a member of his party after the May 16th election. Crosby said Michael Normore's name will remain on the ballot as a progressive conservative candidate, since advanced polling has already taken place. But that's where the relationship ends. If elected, he will not be in the PC caucus, Crosby told reporters. Normore said he'll continue as a candidate in Cartwright-Lance-Eau-Claire, but will act as an independent, even though the PC designation will be next to his name on the ballot. Crosby said Normore was vetted prior to becoming a candidate, and he was aware of his personal views. Now, Crosby supported Normore when questioned by CBC on May 9th, but said he was shown social media posts afterwards and saw unfortunate comments the candidate made on social media which are incompatible with the values the PC party represents and with my own values. I guess it's their own version of the Lake of Fire. Now, there was another candidate that people were expecting this from. That was a candidate for Labrador West, Pentecostal pastor Derek Sharon, who, when becoming a candidate for the PCs, told Crosby he would keep his opinions on social issues quiet. Crosby said he didn't actually ask Sharon what his beliefs were, but wanted assurance he wouldn't bring it up. Crosby said, "I don't think it's up to me to inquire into people's private beliefs, as long as they assure me they are not going to become publicly addressed. Candidates can't be stirring up these kinds of issues in this day and age, and that's been the social settlement for 25 years now." Let's look at that statement for just a second, shall we? You know what I see there? This is what Crosby said. I didn't ask him what he actually believed because I didn't want to know. As long as he shut up about what he believes while campaigning under my banner, that's all I care about. You know, as long as they assure me they are not going to become publicly addressed. So that tells me that, yeah, you can have a candidate who is against gay marriage. You can have a candidate who is against abortion. They just can't talk about them. That's what his explanation says. He didn't reject them. He just said, you can't talk about them if you're going to campaign for me. Now, CBC News reported Normore's views on gay marriage, abortion, and immigration after speaking with the candidate himself and reviewing his social media posts. Normore wrote or said to CBC, "I'm conservative and I'm not in favor of same-sex marriage. That's the way I was brought up." But he stressed those opinions don't supersede the work to be done in his district. The issues of the people of the South Labrador coast certainly come first. Now, 2 hours after dropping Normore from the party, the Progressive Conservatives released an official statement. The PC party fully supports the right of a woman to autonomy over her own body, same-sex couples, and the right of partners to marry without regard to gender or gender identity. The PC party is an inclusive organization that supports the hard-fought rights and freedoms of all people. Now, that doesn't quite sound the same as what Chess didn't say anything like that, now did he? The party statement is clear. Chess, not so much. There were other issues as well. Jerry Dean, a Liberal candidate for the Exploits region, which is in central Newfoundland, was the mayor of Botwood when he made comments about refusing to officiate same-sex marriage ceremonies. In an email statement, when asked, Jerry Dean said, "I am pro-choice. I support same-sex marriage, and I affirm these values through the vetting process involved with my becoming a candidate for the Liberal Party. I support Liberal Party principles, which include openness, inclusiveness, and diversity." See, now that's following the rules. That's what I signed, so that's what I'm going to say. Have a nice day. It's not, well, what I believe, I can believe, I'm just not going to talk about it to you. That's Chess's play. Dwight Ball's play is a little different. Jerry Byrne, the Liberal candidate for Corner Brook, was one of 3 Liberal federal members of Parliament to vote in line with the Conservative bill against same-sex marriage. Another one of those 3 was Bill Matthews, a former federal Liberal MP who is now running as a PC in this provincial election. in the district of Burin-Grand Bank. Now, when asked about Dean, Liberal leader Dwight Ball said he had signed a contract upholding Liberal beliefs, including the approval of same-sex marriage. That's not quite accurate, but it is in essence a fact. The Liberal Party Constitution declares everyone in our society deserves full acceptance regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, race, color, or religion. Party members are expected to advocate and support these principles. So yes, that is a definite difference in just the ethos of the party. I can think of no other way to put it. Normore also made quite a few comments about this typical old, who are we letting in? Who checks these people? You know, I mean, anybody who knows how the federal immigration system actually works, there ain't nobody coming in here that nobody hasn't checked over. It just doesn't happen. It's bullshit. But that's fine. One other thing that came up about the Crosby PC campaign was on May 10th as well. It was in the CBC. Sarah Schmaley, former Crosby staffer, are behind anti-liberal Facebook ads and robocalls. Have you received a robocall about the May 16th election? It may have been from NL Strong, a Newfoundland and Labrador equivalent to Ontario Proud, a right-wing Facebook-based group said to be instrumental in Doug Ford's victory. NL Strong is run by Ches Crosby's former communications director. We are currently conducting phone surveys to better understand issues important to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and aid in meeting our organization's goal of restoring stronger government to the province, said Devin Drover. Drover was PC leader Ches Crosby's communications director during his run in the Windsor Lake by-election and was communications director for the office of the official opposition after Crosby was elected. Drover is listed as one of 3 directors in NL Strong's federal nonprofit incorporation information. The group has also been paying for Facebook ads promoting Crosby and attacking Liberal leader Dwight Ball. Drover says the group has been fundraising to pay for its activities. Ches Crosby said he knows virtually nothing about NL Strong and that there is no money from his campaign going toward the group. The NL Strong Facebook group shares stories from local media outlets with messages like Dwight Ball has got to go, as well as shareable memes and posts from Ontario Proud and its equivalents in other provinces like Alberta Proud and Nova Scotia Proud and the national Canada Proud group. NL Strong is a separate organization with its own focus on Newfoundland and Labrador, Drover said. However, we will share content on our pages from other groups if or when our goals align. Drover is also a director of Nova Scotia Proud. That group was behind robocalls made in February asking Nova Scotia residents how they felt about healthcare wait times and the long gun registry. Drover, who is from Newfoundland and Labrador, told CBC that Nova Scotia Proud was created to raise awareness about the bad governance we are experiencing in Nova Scotia, and that it was not affiliated with any political party. He used the exact same phrasing to describe his reasons for establishing NL Strong. So, there's no issue there at all. There's one big issue, though, as far as Newfoundland goes and their election laws. Now, in Ontario Proud was a registered third-party advertiser in the Ontario election. They were the first since the province introduced legislation forbidding political parties from taking donations from corporations or unions. In Newfoundland and Labrador, there are no Elections Newfoundland rules requiring third-party advertisers to register, nor are there limits on what they can spend. So it's the old British Columbia Wild West thing in Newfoundland. So there's some connections about the Progressive Conservatives and where they might fall in on Team Blue. Khan said he had a prediction of 25 seats for the Liberals, and I'm not sure if it made it into the final edit. If it didn't, that's my fault. Khan said 25 Liberals, 15 PCs, 0 NDP, 0 NL Alliance. That was his prediction. It was recorded 10 days ago now. The Ball did have a bigger lead in all polling than he has now. I have polling from a few days ago. There were 3 polls that came out in a matter of 2 days last week. This is from May 9th. This is from CBC. Forum Research conducted a poll that indicates the PCs have 42%, while the Liberals hold 40% among decided or leaning voters. Lauren Bozinoff, president of Forum Research, sees the Newfoundland and Labrador provincial election after a poll conducted among 856 potential voters was released on May 9th. The difference between the 2 leading parties is within the margin of error, plus or minus 3%, 19 times out of 20, meaning it's too close to confidently say one party is leading over the other. The poll did not account for undecided voters. Now get this. This is a polling guide. When asked why, Bozinoff told the St. John's Morning Show it didn't matter. We take them out because we believe at the end of the day, most of the undecideds will vote the way everyone else will vote. They'll break basically in the same proportions, or they won't vote. Of the 856 respondents in the Forum poll, only 79 said they were undecided. Based on the 777 respondents counted in the results, Forum Research estimates the PCs will win 19 seats, the Liberals 18, and the NDP 3. What will that give us? That will give us another British Columbia. Bozinoff said, what will be fascinating to watch is how the NDP will factor into the final results. Even just a few seats for the third party could mean the difference between a majority and a minority government. This is the 3rd poll released this week, with each showing different results. Abacus data had the PCs 5 percentage points higher than the Liberals among decided voters, while MQO suggested the Liberals had a 12-point lead over the PCs, again among decided voters. Forum Research was the only group of pollsters to accurately predict the PC party was leading in the recent Prince Edward Island election. That is true. I will also say that doing research for my show that covered the PEI election, I solicited input from followers from Prince Edward Island on Twitter, and I was told there that 2 people actually responded pretty much identically that they felt the PCs would eke out a very small majority government. And at the time I was told that, I was like, really? I haven't been hearing that at all. And lo and behold, that's what happened. Anyway, tangent over. The polling suggests the strongest support for the PCs is in the central Newfoundland and Grand Falls-Windsor, where most districts are currently Liberal. Forum Research says 48% of respondents in the region support the PC party, where support for the Liberals is at 37%. The west coast of Newfoundland shows the strongest support for the Liberals, with 45% saying they will vote red. While the numbers for party support is close, the number of people disapproving of all 3 party leaders is even closer. The poll suggested 63% of respondents disapprove of the job Dwight Ball has done as Premier. 37% support him. For Ches Crosby, 55% of people disapprove of his abilities to lead, while 45% approve. For the NDP, 52% disapprove of Alison Coffin's job as leader, while 48% approve. About 40% of respondents did not think there was a winner in the leaders' debate that was on May 1st, neither do I. When asked if they thought Newfoundland and Labrador was better or worse off than it was 4 years ago, 66% said worse. with 42% saying much worse. One more piece that I had to turn to. This is from CBC's great pollster and actual election specialist, I would call him, Eric Grenier, May 10th, so last week. Contradictory polls agree on one thing. Dwight Ball's Liberals are in trouble. Liberal leader Dwight Ball entered this election as the front runner. He might now be entering the final week as the underdog. And as Mr. Grenier goes over here, over 3 days, 3 polls were published, each offering a different picture of the race. One showed Ball and the Liberals with a commanding lead, while another gave Ches Crosby's PCs a healthy edge. The third also gave the nod to Crosby, though by a narrow margin. The poll field dates were pretty close together as well. The Forum poll was on May 3rd and 4th. Abacus was in the field between May 2nd and 5th. But MQO, the one that showed the Liberals with the big lead, was polling from April 25th to May 4th. So a lot of that was before the debate. Now that could explain the difference between the MQO poll and the other two from Forum and Abacus. But the polls give a good indication of where each of the parties have their pockets of strength. All three found the Liberals leading in Labrador and in western Newfoundland. The only parts of the province where the Liberals won seats after they were reduced to 6 in the 2011 election, and where they won by big numbers in 2015. In the Abacus and Forum polls, the PCs had the advantage in central and eastern Newfoundland, leading by 11 points, according to Forum, and 9 points by Abacus. 4 years ago, the PCs only won a single seat in this region. The race appears to be closer on the Avalon Peninsula, though there is less agreement on how exactly it's shaping up. Both MQO and Forum gave the Liberals statistically insignificant leads, while Abacus gave a more comfortable 10-point margin to the PCs. All three of the polls found the NDP with its strongest results there. Not surprising, considering the party is running most of its candidates in and around St. John's. But it does raise a question of where NDP votes will go in the rest of the province, where support for the New Democrats range from 5 to 12%. Those will largely be orphaned votes, as the NDP is only running 3 candidates outside of the Avalon Peninsula. So it's close. I don't know if it's going to matter about all this crap in the last week, about the PCs behaving like every other Conservative party in Canada with the same tricks and operatives and bullshit. We'll see what happens. They vote tomorrow. So, good luck, Newfoundland. Good luck, Labrador. One more thing I wanted to add on, because of course BTR cut the archive off before the episode was actually finished. What a surprise. When I was done the interview with Con, I told him that it's now been 16 years since I left Fort McMurray, and it's been that long since I've had a conversation like that. What a coincidence. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to have an open discussion with a Newfoundlander, you don't know what you're missing. Once again, I thank Con O'Brien for the interview, and that's it for this week. We'll see you next week on The View Up Here. Thank you for listening. Good night.